We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Dan, it's great to have you on. You're obviously one of the biggest British news presenters, has been for quite some time. But let's take it back to where it all started. What was your beginning like into journalism?
Oh, my beginning into journalism was, my goodness, I'm such a geek, actually. I was so young. I was honestly so young. So I grew up in New Zealand, and I was about 12 years old, actually, when I first started my journalism, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. And I always say to people when they're saying, what do you have to do to get into journalism? I'm always just saying, just write. Just present, just do it. And it can't be about money. It's always just got to be about loving it. So I was interviewing people, I was writing for my local newspaper, I was presenting for a local cable show in New Zealand. I just did all of that as a teenager. And so then when I moved to the UK, when I was 21, so I was very young, and I always clarify to people that I am a British citizen. My mum, my dad were born in the UK. My grandparents are from here. Well, my dad was actually born on a British Army base in Malta, because my grandparents were members of the British Army. So I guess I always had this real connection to the UK. But when I moved here when I was 21, my big thing was, I'm going to find a journalism job before I go and work in a bar. So it was difficult, and I had no money and all of that, but it was worth it in the end.
Amazing. And then when did your career really start to pick off? Like when did it really start to?
So I guess my first big job was at News of the World, very controversial newspaper. I've worked for all of the controversial newspapers in the UK, actually, the News of the World, the Sun, and the Daily Mail. They are the three newspapers that I've worked for. So that was my big moment, actually, entering Fleet Street. It was 2007. I was only 24 years old, and I was at the News of the World for 4 years until it closed in 2011, which obviously people probably remember the phone hacking scandal. It was massive and controversial. And so yeah, that's when my journalism career probably really kicked off, but it was quite difficult few years.
What have you noticed that's the biggest changes in journalism now compared to back then? What are some of the big changes that you've seen?
Well, I guess obviously the introduction of citizen journalism, and it's very interesting, I'd say my experience was that, like most people, I guess, back then, I used to trust the mainstream media. So I very much accepted that there were huge biases within the mainstream media, and I knew that the BBC was not an honest broker and that they were on the left. But I think for me, when it changed, and I know for a lot of people it came a bit later during COVID, but for me, when it changed was after the Brexit referendum, because I was so truly horrified and disgusted to see the mainstream media, this body, I guess, that I had considered myself to be part of, work with the British establishment, the deep state, to literally overturn the biggest democratic vote in the history of Britain. I was disgusted by that. I completely lost faith with the mainstream media. Then you enter 2020. And by that point, by the way, I've got my daily show on Talk Radio, which at the time was, I guess, one of the bastions for free speech within the mainstream media. So it's still part of the Murdoch empire. But if you're going to be in the mainstream media and you want to be supporting free speech, obviously Talk Radio was a big pro-Brexit station as well. And I was there. I just actually started my drive time show. So Monday to Thursday, 4 p.m. till 7 p.m. And I started it in February 2020. And of course, the world was about to change. So I started this little radio show, and I was expecting to build it up over a number of years. And I was very, very passionate about it. Well, within weeks, days actually, really, we're all locked in our homes. you probably remember the big moment in the course of the day would be, especially in the early days of the COVID madness, was that 5 o'clock government briefing where everyone tuned in because it was like, what the hell is happening? And so that obviously was broadcast within the course of my show. I was able to ask the Prime Minister some questions and be part of that briefing from my radio studio a couple of times. But very quickly, I became one of the big anti-lockdown people, one of the few, really, within the British media. I'd say, and I give credit to Peter Hitchens and Toby Young, who were leading the charge. But very quickly, within a mainstream media context, I was one of the only people, and it became an obsession for me ending that lockdown. And so I guess in terms of when I saw things really change, there were those two moments, Brexit and COVID. And by that point, I wanted out and left at the end of 2020 to help launch GB News.
I definitely remember your voice during COVID being, you were one of very few people. I can't remember any, I couldn't think of anyone else that was so vocal about anti-lockdowns. And I felt like there was a lot of the population was ignored because a lot of people felt the same way, but you're almost scared to say it because then people would say like, you don't care about elderly people, you don't care about the people. So what was that like? Because you were so vocal about it. What was that feedback like when you came out and said that we need
Well,
to
it
end?
was really hard. It was really hard. I certainly lost friends, and I had a lot of colleagues who were looking at me as if I was crazy. And I'd just say, "Oh, at the Sun, oh, Dan, can you not write your column about lockdown this week?" And it's like, well, what else is going on? The whole economy is being destroyed. Kids' lives are being destroyed. What else? What else do you expect me to write about? But I'm one of those people, I always really look at the positives from very negative situations. And there was a huge positive for me that came out of being an anti-lockdown campaigner, in that we formed an incredible alliance. And don't get me wrong, we're all independent thinkers. So nothing was formalized. There was no like formal anti-lockdown group. And there's still a lot of disagreement between us over particular issues. But what I would say is a whole load of anti-establishment thinkers came together, and some of them were in the mainstream media. So people like Alison Pearson and Julia Hartley-Brewer, both really good friends of mine, but certainly we bonded and became close over that experience. But then also lots of people who were outside of that. So Molly Kingsley, for example, who set up the brilliant organization Us for Them, which was all about campaigning for children during lockdown and to keep schools open. So Alan Miller, who now runs the brilliant Together Declaration, which is all about fighting against the establishment on a whole load of issues. And to be honest, there's a long list of people, Dr. Renee Holdicap, Tonya Buxton, Bernie Spofford, all of these brilliant independent thinkers. And we all came together because we were so stunned by what was happening to our country. So I think that gave me a really solid grounding when I started at GB News to sort of think, okay, this is our crew, these are our people.
And then going on to GB News, you obviously had, primetime show on the main face of GB News. What was that whole experience like before you started doing your own stuff? Because, I pretty much from what I remember, you were the main face sort of GB News during its launch.
Well, it was very difficult, very, very difficult. GB News had an almost impossibly bad birth. And I wouldn't say that was down to the presenters. It was down to the situation that we were put in, which was no one in the establishment or the mainstream media wanted GB News to work. And then we gave them lots of reasons to attack us. But actually, we were a joke to begin with. GB News was a joke to begin with. I don't know if you remember that time, but the lighting wouldn't work and the microphones wouldn't
Yeah.
work and all of that. It was all very stressful. And God, I mean, it's one of those things you don't want to talk up what you're doing, because of course we're only in the media and we're not saving lives or fighting fires or anything like that. But it was certainly a massive challenge, because I was hosting at that point for 3 hours a night, 5 days a week. I knew it was so important that this venture succeeded, and I put my heart and my soul and my life into it, pretty much. Andrew Neil, he's a properly establishment guy. He quit after 2 weeks, didn't even come back. That was obviously hugely disappointing, but I think in the end it was probably the making of the channel in lots of ways, because it meant that we did go down this very daring anti-establishment path. Obviously, Nigel Farage came on board pretty quickly. I was the first person actually on my launch show. I actually had Nigel Farage on. I was always a big believer that he should be a big part of the channel, but to begin with, a lot of the management and people like Andrew Neil were like, "No, we can't have Nigel Farage associated with the station," and they were actually only going to put him on a Sunday morning, but have him balanced up with someone like Alistair Campbell, because I guess they were so nervous. But I think hopefully I set the tone pretty early on that GB News should very much be an anti-establishment station, and then some really brave voices came on board. I mean, I had Father Calvin Robinson on the show right from the start, had Lawrence Fox there from the early days, and then Mark Stein came on board to host the 8 p.m. show. So, look, it was a great couple of years, but also a very stressful couple of years, and obviously it ended for me in a terrible manner.
Did you think in some ways that was a blessing? Because I watch your YouTube show now, and it's like you've almost got this freedom to speak your mind, and it seems a lot more authentic. So do you think in some ways that was a blessing?
Yeah, I do now.
Yeah.
But I really didn't at the time, because Dr. Jordan Peterson describes being cancelled, and I was certainly cancelled by the definition of what cancellation is. And he describes it as being the worst experience a human being can go through other than receiving a terminal illness diagnosis. And having been through cancellation, I do agree with him, because it touches all aspects of your life. That's the issue with it. So your work, your financial situation, your family, your friends, cancellation touches everything. And unfortunately, you learn a lot about, I guess, the weakness of the human spirit in lots of ways too, and how quickly people are prepared to run away from trouble. So it was very difficult. However, I look at it now and I think, obviously, this was the greatest thing that happened to me, because the entire media is changing. There's a revolution going on. It is all moving towards independence. I am now the true definition of independent, because there are some people who claim to be independent, but actually they have big financial backers and investors. I don't. I'm owned by my audience. I am completely independent. So that means I don't need to march to the beat of anyone else's drum. Probably one of the reasons why I ended up going from GB News was because I wasn't just prepared to do whatever the investors wanted me to do. That's not how I operated. That's not how I believe journalism should be. And I'd say GB News is very captured now in lots of ways, captured by regulators, captured by their investors. The presenters are very controlled in lots of ways, and I am certainly not. Of course, there are risks and constraints that you have to work in, because I have to be distributed via big tech.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm always encouraging people, please sign up to my Substack. Please sign up to my Substack, Dan Wootton Outspoken, because the difference with Substack, it is still a big tech platform, I guess you could argue, although it's not in anywhere comparable to, a Facebook or a Meta or anything like that. But the difference with Substack is they actually allow you to own your own database of subscribers. So if I'm ever cancelled, if someone has subscribed to me on Substack, and you can subscribe completely for free, by the way, but it just means I can always take my audience with me to the next venture. If I am cancelled by YouTube or X or whatever platform it happens to be. So I definitely think it's a blessing now. I'm not owned by anyone. I'm certainly much, much more outspoken. That's the name of my show. I'd like to think more authentic, because There's no one in my ear. There's no off communists. And I also just think it's where the media is going in so many different ways. I mean, I was very inspired by people like Meghan Kelly in the US, who has absolutely thrived
Yeah.
since being cancelled and is now, I would argue, a more important voice than anyone on Fox News.
It's crazy the power of just what we're doing. Like I saw even Novak Djokovic where he refused to
Yeah.
have the interview with Channel 9, and I think the apology got around a million or two views, and his one got like 75 million views
Yeah.
of him
And
on.
he's just like, boom, just
Yeah,
like, boom, do it on the phone. And, that is part of the thing. It's about being braver. It's about realizing that there are lots of different ways. I guess with me, because I come from a traditional media background, I still wanted to set up a show, make it feel and look professional, have guests, but you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that now. If you have a phone and you have a strong enough message and you have interesting things to say that are not in the mainstream media, there are ways for the audience to find you now. So it's almost like the democratization of news.
well, it's a really exciting time, and I think it'd be good place to start talking about one of your big sort of exciting like scoops and stories. I think the one that comes to my mind is the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry stepping away from their royal duties. What was that like? How did you get that information, and what was it like telling the whole world that was going to happen?
Well, there'd been a big build up to it, I guess, because I mean, I certainly say it's the story that was probably the biggest story I broke because, of course, Harry and Meghan leaving the royal family was very unexpected to a lot of people, and it did change the course of royal history. And it had real repercussions as well for the British royal family, but also for Harry and Meghan themselves. However, at the time, it was just, I guess, a succession of stories that I had broken about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's time within the royal family. Because again, what I had noticed, and for people who don't follow the royal family, it's quite an interesting setup, actually. How it works is there's something called the Royal Rota. Now, Prince Harry has railed against the Royal Rota, but I was never a part of the Royal Rota. So what the Royal Rota is like the official mainstream media journalists who cover the royal family, and they get access to the events, and they have to go and, here I am today watching Prince William cut a ribbon. And
Yeah,
they are, I guess, the official court, the people who report on the court circular and what is going on within the royal family. But that means, unfortunately, very often they do not have the bravery to break big stories about what's really going on within the royal family, because they have to see these people every day, that they're quite controlled, I guess, in a way, because they're so reliant on, the communication secretaries or the courtiers or whatever. Whereas I was an outsider, and I guess my whole career I've been an outsider. I've never been inside Westminster. I've never been inside the royal family. That's not what I do. I've always been an outsider, and I would argue outsiders make the best journalists, because you're not captured and controlled, and you don't socialize with these people. You're not friends with these people. I think that's really important, because if you look at this from a Westminster context, they're all hanging out with each other. They're all going for drinks every night. That then becomes very hard for you to sometimes report the truth about these people who you view as your drinking buddies or your mates in a work context. And sometimes that even crosses over into a personal context. So when it came to the royal family and the Harry and Meghan story specifically, I knew that there was all of this discontent behind the scenes within the royal family about the appalling behavior of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, but it wasn't being reported. So even though there was a member of the Royal Rota at The Sun, where I was executive editor at the time, and I mean, this woman, she hated me because she was just like, you stay off my territory. What are you doing coming in and breaking these stories? But we had an editor who's a really brave guy called Tony Gallagher. He's actually now the editor of the Times newspaper. He's a Murdoch veteran. But what's interesting is most Murdoch editors are very subservient when it comes to the royal family. But Tony secretly was a bit of a Republican. So even though I'm a major monarchist and I absolutely believe in the royal family and I want the royal family to survive and thrive, what that meant is Tony was prepared for me to break these very controversial stories about what was really going on within the royal family. So long before Megxit, I sometimes get the years confused, but I think it was probably 2 years before. Yeah, 2 years before Megxit, I started breaking the stories about what was really going on within the royal family. And they were really sensational looking back because you don't often get the real sort of insight about what's going on with the royal family. But this was about, I mean, the first story became known as Tiara Gate, and it was about the fact that the late Queen Elizabeth II had actually spoken to Prince Harry and warned him about the behavior of Meghan Markle. And within that story was also the fact that Meghan Markle had fallen out with Catherine, the Princess of Wales, over the way that she was speaking to Catherine's staff at Kensington Palace. So that first story then resulted in scoop after scoop after scoop about all of the shocking actions that was taking place behind the scenes within the royal family, all of the things Meghan was doing, all of the fallout. And that eventually resulted in the story of Megxit, because I had built up over that period of time a lot of contacts from within the royal family who knew, I guess, that I was going to deliver as much as I could an unvarnished version of the truth. And believe me, Harry and Meghan tried to shut me down. I mean, they took
Wow.
me to this thing called IPSO, which is the regulator of British newspapers, and they even won one of their cases against me. It was ludicrous. It was about a car park, believe it or not. But and I won't even bore you with the details, but the point is they wanted to shut me down because I was reporting the truth. And when it came to Megxit, we later learned in Prince Harry's autobiography Spare, where he described me as the sad little man. That was his little nickname for me. And we discovered that he was so desperate to stop me breaking the story of Megxit in January 2020 that he had actually called up the Queen. I mean, why are you bothering the Queen about this? She's in her 90s, leave her alone. But he'd called up the Queen and said, the son has this story, the sad little man has the story, so we're going to break the story. And of course, the late Queen and now King Charles didn't want that, because they were like, well, nothing's sorted. Just allow the story to run. So they did allow the story to run. And I was very relieved, because the one thing, if you're a journalist and you've got a big scoop, the worst thing someone can do to you is release the story before you have a chance to publish. So actually, I released the story, and it took about 12 hours or something like that until Harry and Meghan actually ran their statement confirming the news on Instagram. And then it all kicked off. It all kicked off after that.
I remember the sit down with Oprah and all that stuff
Yes.
that followed, which was just crazy. Where did it go wrong for Meghan Markle? Like, was this, if you like, was this always going to happen from the start of the
Yes.
relationship? Was that always the case?
I really do believe that now. I really, really do believe that. I think she had no intention of staying long term within the royal family. I have lots to back that up, by the way. I mean, she was working with her Hollywood team the whole time she was in the royal family. They were lining up commercial deals for her. I mean, who does that? She never really understood it, which is quite interesting, because she's clearly not a stupid woman. She was a mature woman. She wasn't a young woman like Princess Diana. I mean, this was a divorcee in her mid-30s. But I think she was very disappointed that life within the royal family wasn't like life in Hollywood, where you are treated like an untouchable star, where you have people doing everything for you. You really are pampered. And Meghan was a real diva too. She was one of those big time divas who, even though she was only really a D-list actress, I mean, I know a lot of people love Suits, and especially now a lot of people love Suits. But I have to be honest with you, When the story first broke about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, I had never heard of her. I had never
Oh,
heard of her. I hadn't watched Suits at that point. So this wasn't a big star.
no.
This was a mediocre, dime a dozen American sort of TV actress. And this was the biggest break of her life. But what was so interesting, she comes into the royal family. She's like, oh my goodness, I've got to work. And, there's no huge mansion for me with a pool. And, they are very pampered in America. So I think quite early on, Meghan knew that there was going to have to be an exit plan. She needed to get out.
I think I've heard you talk about this. What do you think the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle looks like? Do you see them envision them staying together or?
Not long term, and I never did. I always gave it 10 years. It has been fascinating to see the mainstream media catch up on reporting that I've been doing for some time on this. I mean, the Vanity Fair cover expose is really interesting because Vanity Fair is not the type of publication that really turns on members of the royal family on the whole. They're pretty slavishly loyal. It was obviously a magazine that Princess Diana loved and would do photo shoots with, and they're on the side of the monarchy. And so to see Vanity Fair reveal a whole load of terrible information about Harry and Meghan, including, by the way, the fact that their former staff need long-term therapy, all of that type of stuff. None of this is new, but it's really big deal that it's coming from Vanity Fair. But for me, the most shocking revelation in that cover article was the fact that, and look, I'd known about this, but to see Vanity Fair reported is just a really big deal. The fact that Meghan Markle was lining up a post-divorce tell-all autobiography deal
Wow.
when she still remains in her marriage with Prince Harry. I mean, that gives you some indication as to where this is going, but it's not going to be easy for Harry to get out. Obviously, I think he should get out. When you know your wife is planning to do that, surely getting out is the only option. But, this is a guy who has lost all his friends, lost all of his family, now lives in Los Angeles. The children are effectively Americans now, so it's not like Harry can just say, oh, see you later, I'm taking the children back to the UK. So there's a whole load of issues, but I do have no sympathy for Prince Harry. He completely created the situation himself, and the way that he turned on his own family was just disgusting and terrible.
I couldn't agree more. I think that when he started, bad mouthing the Queen on national TV, it's like you forget it's the Queen, it's your grandmother. Who does that on
Totally.
national TV?
And not only that, she's in her mid-90s. These are her final years on Earth. And you have decided to cause her all of this stress. And I think that's why monarchists will never forgive Harry, whether he's with Meghan or not.
Definitely. And I think it's just I think that whole relationship seemed so bizarre. When did you see the signs of them this sort of breakup or the problems? When was the first thing? Was this right from the bat? Was it right when they?
No, because Harry was totally drunk on love. Do you know what I mean? That's something that happens, isn't it? Especially if you're with someone who's encouraging you to ditch all of your friends and your family. So no, it's when things started to go wrong, and that is probably a natural reaction, isn't it? When all of the deals started to fall apart. Meghan had managed to convince Harry that she was this great businesswoman and that she was, a Hollywood expert, and they were going to go over there and make all of this money. And look, to begin with, they did. They have mega deal from Spotify, mega deal from Netflix. The types of deals, actually, that if they hadn't have been greedy and they had just worked hard, actually, they wouldn't have needed to work again in their lives. But the problem is those deals are reliant on you providing the goods. You actually have to deliver, and they just couldn't do that. And so I think quite early on, probably, certainly by 2022, all of a sudden it's falling apart, and Netflix isn't happy with the ideas. Spotify isn't happy with the ideas. Actually, this isn't going to be easy. So I think there's been a period of time over the past couple of years in particular where Harry has realized, oh my goodness, this woman sold me a bit of a pup. This is not as easy as she told me it was going to be. And of course, that puts pressure on the marriage. Now, look, if you believe the friends who are speaking to Vanity Fair, or the people close to Harry and Meghan speaking to Vanity Fair, they say, no, 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 they're still madly in love. But I mean, you only have to look at the body language when they appear in public to know that just isn't true. The way that he is with his wife is completely different to what it used to be.
What happens next for Prince Harry in this situation if they get a divorce or whatever? What happens to Prince Harry?
I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for him. I mean, he is acutely conscious of the fact that he only has this window of his life, really, to do big things. And it's a weird way the monarchy works, right? But I wouldn't actually disagree with Harry on this point. He made it clear that he knows that once Prince George turns 18 and is an adult doing his own thing, that all of a sudden the attention drains away from Harry and moves to the new heir. And look, he might have a little bit longer because knowing Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, I imagine they're going to want to try and protect George, Charlotte, and Louis for as long as possible. And of course, really, with William and Catherine, they sort of had the luxury of their 20s to still do their own thing and not, even though they were full-time royals, they weren't necessarily leading a full-time royal life. So Harry might have a little bit longer than he thinks when it comes to George, but certainly he has wasted this golden opportunity. And so it's going to be very difficult for Harry.
Well,
I don't see an easy way out of all of this mess for him now that he has created himself.
it'll be a tough one to Harry to see whether he stays in the US or comes back to the UK. Talking of UK, there's obviously so much going on in the last few months. What's your take on, in particular, what was Sir Keir Starmer? I mean, I know a lot of people. I had no real optimism of him being remotely successful, but I didn't think it'd be this bad this quickly. What's your take been on Sir Keir Starmer is these 6 months? Pretty much.
Slippery Starmer, as I call him. Well, I hate to say I told you so, but I knew it was going to be this bad. I absolutely did. I mean, I was warning through my entire time on GB News. This guy is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He is going to destroy the country. Don't believe this stuff that he's some type of centrist, boring guy. He is completely ideologically driven, and that is exactly what's happened. I mean, has it been worse than I expected? I guess so, because to see the way that he has gaslit and lied to the public over so many issues, but obviously the one that I have covered extensively on Outspoken has been in regards to the Southport massacre and the cover-up surrounding that. So yes, it's bad. I always knew it was going to be bad. There isn't much reason for optimism because the UK has these ridiculously long 5-year parliamentary terms. However, I actually do feel quite a lot of hope in the sense that politically, Starmer is so out of touch with the rest of the world and where politics is heading. And so it is going to be incredibly difficult for him to cling on. He is so unpopular. I don't think that's going to turn around. So he thinks, oh, I'm doing all of these unpopular things at the start and then the economy is going to boom. I don't buy that. I think he has fundamentally lost the trust of the British public. I think he is a nasty piece of work. I think he is a liar. And I think it's going to be bad. But actually, hopefully, what this is going to do is herald a completely new start for the United Kingdom, where we turn on the Uni Party, we smash the system. But of course, it's all to play for. There is a long way to go. And the thing about the UK is that we are very much tied into this first past the post electoral system, which does make it incredibly difficult to boot out a party that has won a landslide majority. And the reason that the system just doesn't work is that Starmer shouldn't have won a landslide majority. He only had 30 something percent of the vote. He didn't deserve a landslide in the way that Thatcher or Tony Blair won their landslides.
It's really worrying to see. I think would never vote for Keir Starmer or whatever. But I was similar. I saw him as somebody who just didn't have a lot going on in his head, just a very plain, boring person. But I think I completely got that wrong. I think this is a serious somebody who belongs close to the far left. And it's amazing how whether his publishing team, whatever his marketing team, have been able to make him just sort of boring.
Well, he didn't say much, did he? He didn't need to say much because the British Conservative Party were in self-destruct mode. So he just had to effectively be an alternative, look like someone who was sensible enough. And really, the mainstream media never put him under any pressure either because they were in the tank for Starmer.
It's an interesting one. And you've covered we're talking about the Southport massacre in quite a lot of detail in the last few months. And what's that been like? Because you again, I feel like you had an earlier scoop into this than most people, and a lot of the information was clearly not given or, quite frankly, lied about. What's been your take on this whole issue?
Well, I mean, it's been incredibly important. I've, again, been so disappointed by the mainstream media, even my former employer at GB News, who seemed to just make a decision to say, oh, we're not going to talk about it at all. We're not going to talk about Axel Rudikabana at all because we're so worried about contempt of court. And it's like, yeah, the contempt of court rules in the UK are very serious and they do shut down a lot of free speech. But I'm sorry, there have been ways to cover this story without going into contempt of court. Just sort of saying, oh, we're not going to talk about it for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months is lunacy. And especially given the fact that Starmer has now admitted that he does think this is a terror attack. Well, I'm sorry, people like me who were suggesting that it was a terrorist attack back in July were branded as far-right thugs, trying to encourage riots and violence. So, look, it has caused huge damage to the psyche of the country. It has been a difficult story to cover, but such an important one because, look, what is my job now? It is to cover the truth of big stories that the country care about, where the mainstream media are not prepared to go there for whatever reason. And there was no better example of that than Southport and what happened.
Why are mainstream media so scared to do it? You said the contempt of court, but okay, you found ways of reporting the story without breaking those rules. They arguably have even all their lawyers, all their teams.
Totally.
Yeah. So why are they so worried about producing this story?
I don't think it fits the narrative, does it? Certainly, if you're looking at the vast majority of the mainstream media, doesn't fit the narrative. They are fully in the tank for this Labour government. It was the worst thing that could have happened near the start of Starmer's term. So the much easier thing to do is to cover these awful far-right thugs who are all violent, terrible Neanderthals and should be locked up for months or even years. I mean, and the fact that the mainstream media has not covered the discrepancies in the sentences and the revolting level of two-tier justice that we have seen since the so-called riots, and I call them so-called riots, and I know people like David Starkey disagree with me on this, but I really do, because there were actually very, very few people who were involved in any type of violence. And the fact that there was not a national outcry about the likes of Lucy Connolly and Julie Sweetie, mothers and grandmothers who are still behind bars, still locked up after receiving over 2-year sentences for posts on X and Facebook, is insane. It is completely and utterly insane.
Is this worrying? Because we've still got a long time left of Keir Starmer. This is like, there's not the we've only had 6 months. So he's still got a long time in. Is it worrying in terms of what he could, the continuous damage he
Yes.
keep doing?
Hugely worrying, hugely worrying. I mean, look, he's certainly also really terrified, I think, the British public, because all of a sudden there are a lot of ordinary folk who are thinking, goodness me, if I do say something, I could end up in jail. Who's going to look after my children? Look at the case of Peter Lynch, the anti sorry, the pro Brexit campaigner who ended up dead in prison because he received such a ludicrously long sentence for his part in these so-called riots where there was no violence. There was absolutely no violence. I mean, so you can understand people are scared, and that is exactly what Starmer wanted. By the time there was any type of national debate led by him over the Southport massacre, he wanted people to be terrified that they could end up in jail.
I think he's largely done that. I think there is a lot of people in the country that are terrified, what they say, what they don't say. And I think the other more worrying thing is it's just what happens next. We this has been 6 months. What's the next step from
Totally.
this? And
Totally. And especially when you look at the fact that uh, Rachel Reeves has destroyed the economy. Another thing that I warned about when I was back in Liz Truss's very controversial mini budget. We need growth. And so there's going to be big financial pressures. That means big personal pressures on people when it comes to their pocketbook. And that is all going to create a tinderbox, really, tinderbox Britain.
but the damage Rachel Reeves has done is far greater than even Liz Truss's mini budget. And I think that really shows when you're talking about the mainstream agenda, the criticism Liz Truss got from that budget compared to the lack of what Rachel Reeves has got is
Well, of course,
absolutely.
and it just shows that it was all about getting Liz Truss out. That's what it was all about. It was an absolute establishment and deep state plot because you cannot tell me that if it comes to gilt yields, for example, that the Britain was an absolute crisis and the economy was close to tanking and everything was going to go wrong and it was leading the news every day. Rachel Reeves does exactly the same thing, not in terms of her policy prescription, but in terms of the result, and it's barely covered by the mainstream media. So that's the problem with the mainstream media. They are able to whip up hysterias, which then have political repercussions. And the other big example of that was, of course, Boris Johnson and Partygate, which I covered extensively during my time on GB News. It was a complete whipped up hysteria. And what it was designed to do was make it impossible for Boris Johnson to be prime minister, impossible for him to do what he wanted to do, what he needed to do. And look, in lots of ways, Boris was a disappointment, but I did support him as prime minister for lots of reasons. Didn't support him what he did over COVID, but did, for example, when it came to Brexit. But the mainstream media just made it impossible for Boris Johnson to govern. They made it impossible for Liz Truss to govern. Whereas what you're seeing now with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves is quite the opposite. They are their cheerleaders. So even though Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are doing things far, far worse than Boris and Liz Truss ever did, they fundamentally have the support of the establishment and the deep state. And this is why when people like Elon Musk talk about and Donald Trump talk about the importance of the mainstream media being destroyed, I completely agree. And that's why. It's because the mainstream media, with their falsehoods, are able to create narratives which then feed in to actually what happens. You see, it's more than just being a sort of observer. They are dishonest actors who actually then become they become a part of the narrative.
I think during both the Liz and Boris, I was very disappointed with a lot of the Conservative MPs not, almost having the courage or just the balls to just withstand that, like not to listen and not to bow into. I was very disappointed on both those occasions
Big
where
time. Me
they,
too.
they just almost collapsed on that. But how important is Elon and Donald Trump? Do you think this is if you like, something of optimism for people in
Yes.
Britain to look at those two?
Oh, absolutely. I feel incredibly optimistic. And the anti MAGA movement was completely defeated this time around. The media is in retreat in America. And by that, I'm talking about the mainstream media. They are having to completely recalibrate because they realized, oh my goodness, we have no influence. We have no influence anymore. We can't lie to the public. And that's what needs to happen in the UK. I mean, it's hilarious. Kamala Harris had the entire mainstream media fighting for her, the entire celebrity class, even Taylor Swift, who we were told. And by the way, I like Taylor Swift. I've known Taylor Swift for many, many years because I was one of the journalists who wrote about her in the UK. So I've known her since she was a much younger artist. But we were told that Taylor Swift had so much influence that the deep state genuinely believed that she would swing the election. She endorsed Kamala Harris. It made absolutely no difference. We do not want to be told what to do by privileged and pampered celebrities, be it Meghan Markle or Taylor Swift. Those days are over. And what the independent media allowed in the US was for actually different types of conversations to take place. Deep conversations, lengthy conversations, the types of conversations like we're having now, where you could really get to know Donald Trump or JD Vance and realize that the mainstream narrative that was being propagated about them was just a lie. I mean, look at their ridiculous narrative regarding JD Vance, for example, when he received the vice presidential nomination. You would have believed, if you just followed the mainstream media, that this guy was a sexist, evil bastard. That could not be further from the truth. He is an incredibly inspiring American with the type of backstory that the mainstream media should love if they weren't so anti-Trump. And so I think there's been a real change. And that change in America, do I find it inspiring? Absolutely. Because obviously what I hope is that platforms like this, the types of conversations that we're having now, in 4 years' time, when the next election in the UK rolls around, will hopefully be much more influential collectively than what the mainstream media currently is. But do we have some catching up to do? Absolutely, we do. We're well behind America when it comes to this stuff at the moment.
Where do you see the next UK, where do you see its revolution coming from? Do you see it coming from Reform, the Conservative Party? Where do you see this sort of, or maybe something different to emerge?
I mean, I do see it coming from Reform UK and Nigel Farage. I said the day that Nigel Farage declared his candidacy in Clacton, which was obviously a big 180 for him, I predicted that he would be Prime Minister by 2029. I think probably what I see my role as, though, is making sure that Reform UK and Nigel Farage don't become the Conservative Party 2.0, that they don't move so much towards the centre, that they aren't actually providing any real viable alternative. He has to lead a Trump-like movement. That's what I want to see Farage do.
Well, exciting times. I mean, I think the disappointing thing in the UK is it's just how much longer are we going to have
Yeah.
Keir Starmer in there? Do you see a change in leadership for Labour before the next election? And a lot of people have been saying that. Do you see something like that happening?
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
A change in leadership? So somebody.
Yeah, I mean, yes, not immediately, but fundamentally, even though there's a very different system within the Labour Party in terms of changing a leader, and Starmer did win them that landslide, as I've said earlier in the interview, I think it was a dishonest landslide, and I do think that probably eventually the pressure of the polls will get to them. I know a lot of people have this idea of Wes Streeting taking over, but actually think it would be much more likely for there to be a left-wing candidate to replace Keir Starmer, which would mean a Prime Minister Angela Rayner,
Wow.
which is an even more terrifying thought.
Yeah. Well, on that scary note, we'll try and round it up here. It's been great to have you, Dan. We have like a closing sort of tradition on this show where
Yes.
essentially I ask the guest for them to say an unpopular opinion that they think should be popular. So it can be something that we've discussed on the show now. It could be trivial. It could be whatever you like. So an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular.
Rich people have to start paying for the NHS, especially to go and see a doctor. I am a huge believer in that. If we want to have a world class system where if you get cancer, you are treated properly, it is utterly ridiculous that millionaires, that very successful people can go to see their GP for free. I actually don't believe anyone should go and see their GP for free. That is an unpopular opinion. But what it means is that we don't value our health system at all. We don't put a value on going to see the doctor, and there is so much wasted time, wasted millions. I want the health system. I don't even like calling it the NHS, to be honest, because I don't buy into this idea that the NHS is untouchable and it's something that all Brits should be so proud of. So I would say that would be my unpopular opinion. You've got to start paying to go and see the GP. It will be worth it, though, because when you get cancer or when one of your family members get cancer, if you were paying for the GP, you would get much better treatment, much better medication, because it would help turn the NHS around.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I'm sure that all interests a few people. I'm sure doctors are probably overall happy with
Yeah,
that comment.
definitely, because
But
so many people just don't show up to their appointments, which wastes a huge amount of money and time.
definitely. Well, thanks for your time, Dan. It's been amazing to have you on.
Thank you so much.